Hello, everyone. My name is Vercruysse, and today I'll be talking about uncovering the paper traces of the Belgium internet. Who am I? Well, I'm a history student at Ghent University, and this presentation fits as a part of my master's thesis, a history of the Belgian web. I'm getting helped by the KBR and DNS Belgium in my research, and my central question is, how did the Belgium internet come to be? I use interviews and newspapers and a lot of other things to discover the history of the Belgian web. And you might ask yourself, yeah, why now? Well, obviously, because the internet is very topical. And one of the most important things and interesting things is that the people who are the foundation of the Belgium internet are still able to be interviewed today, which is very interesting, of course. This is a three-part presentation. I will first talk about Belgium pre-internet. What I mean by that is when Belgium was connected with computer networks, but it was not with the infrastructure or architecture of the internet as we know it of today, that comes later. Then Belgium, when joining the internet, making use of DNS and the .be. I will also talk a bit about rules and the following discussions and even attacks on Belgium internet that reached the peak in 1999. First of all, I should maybe explain what a vague term like the Belgium internet is. I have, for the purpose of this presentation, defined the Belgium internet as everything concerning the Belgian domain, so the .be. The .be was founded in 1988, and as of today is managed by DNS Belgium, which also manages .Vlaanderen, .Flanders, and .Brussels. It is a non-profit organization. And for those who know the structure of the complicated government in Belgium, might ask themselves, well, why is there not a Walloon domain? Well, it's simply because the Walloon government was not interested, so it doesn't exist. As of today, there are about 1,744,589 registered domain. Most of them are located in the Belgium national borders, but there is one that circles the world and is used by Google, the youtube.be, which is used for shortening URLs, and is of course a wordplay on youtube.be. Belgium pre-internet in the 80s. There were about 2 communication networks in Belgium if you wanted to send files or if you wanted to get news or emails. And the first of them is EARN. EARN is a European academic and research network. And as the name suggests, provided mostly internet access to research institutes. The infrastructure was provided by IBM and was in Belgium free because it was sponsored by the science policy. Secondly, there was EUNet, or the European Unix network. As the name suggests, it at its core was the technology of Unix, which might sound unfamiliar today, but is at the core of all Mac OS systems, so it is still in use today. It made use of a special Unix to Unix copy protocol, but the fundamental drawback in Belgium was that it cost money, which to use the net. And since this was not for research institutes, but for individuals themselves, private persons, it might have been an obstruction on going on the net. So there are a few problems. First of all, obviously, there are 2 networks and not one network as we know it today. Secondly, the cost. And thirdly, something maybe not that easy to think of, but the complicated email addresses were definitely a problem. Because as you can see, an EUNet and EARN had 2 different structures, and you actually had to know the whole network to send a file to someone. That means that for normal persons, it's very difficult if you don't know which servers you need to access and send information through. What is the solution then? Well, there would become one .be domain that sends traffic down to 2 networks, and that was made possible because in the late 80s, DNS was actually starting to break through. So an initiative was taken, and it was taken by different actors. First of all, the director of EARN in Belgium, then also the director of EUNet in Belgium, and lastly by Pierre Verbaeten, who would become the future administrator of the Belgium internet. Of course, one could not simply create a national domain, and there had a request had to be made by the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, which was located in California in America, short for IANA. And when the request was made, IANA asked Pierre Verbaeten and the directors, yes, are you representative of the Belgium internet community? Of course, that's problematic because there simply wasn't an internet community at the time. So to get the request done and to get access to .be, a lot of communication started between, first of all, the Belgium Science Policy Office, which said, yeah, it's okay, you can do that. And secondly, de Regie voor Telefonie en Telegraaf, which was a governmental organization for telecommunications in Belgium, and is now the biggest telecommunications provider in Belgium, known as Proximus. But they simply said they weren't interested in the internet. So in 1988, the request was confirmed, and there was nothing heard from IANA for some time. We only know that the .be suddenly existed because an American researcher sent an email to his colleague in Brussels, and then we all of a sudden realized, oh, the .be is online. Since then, it is hosted at KU Leuven, and as it remained until the 2000s. In 1991, there was the first time the connection to the internet as we know it today with IP, and that happened via Amsterdam. And in 1994, the first commercial services started, and the first 129 domain names were registered. When you wanted to apply for a domain, it was a very manual process. Emails existed, but were not as easy to use at the time. So you had to fax your application, which originally was free of any cost, but later became paying. But when you wanted to register for a domain, you had to follow some strict rules. Those strict rules led to discussions and probably had an influence on, have an influence on web archiving today, because as we will see, only registered organizations were allowed to have a domain in the first years. Some of these strict rules, as I just said before, were formal registered organizations, so no private or personal domains were allowed. Political parties quickly joined since 1995, but the government and unions took some time to join the internet and when they were allowed on the internet. Another rule was that it had to be at least 3 characters long. And there were some other restrictions, but they were actually only checked at the moment of registration. So when the domain was registered for 2 years, it might have not been checked anymore. That ultimately led to abuse. Why were there such strict rules? Well, mostly because of pragmatic reasons. There were about 3 persons working there at the time, so to keep it doable, they had some strict rules. Some of the abuse started when a political figure registered his wine company, something he was allowed to do. But he used it for his own political program, and that was not allowed. But the website still existed. Obviously, other politicians started discussions and said, well, we also want our own website. But ultimately, it was decided that was not allowed. Another person tried to register the whole dictionary, which obviously was not allowed. And questions started when businesses started registering generic names like beer or lawyer. A lot of discussion happened, but also that was not allowed, which led to some problems. The peak of the abuse was in 1999 when a burglary happened at the KU Leuven Computer Science Department during Leuven Fair, which at the moment the KU Leuven still ran the whole Belgian internet. Hackers tried to attempt to take over the whole .be, and probably use it for malicious intent. But they did not find the main server, luckily. When they found out, well, it is not going that well, they tried to erase all traces. And they plan to re-enter the next weekend again to continue and hoping to find the main server. But an employee already discovered on Monday that something was fishy about the log reports and something was wrong, and the burglary was discovered. End of story? Well, no. A few days later, the computer science department was contacted by the hackers in an attempt to blackmail. But the computer science department didn't give in. They told the professors there, well, we're going to leak this to the press and it will be a big scandal. Since the computer science department did not continue following the blackmail, the hackers did leak to the media. So was there then a big scandal? Well, no, actually. At the time when the leak happened, the Belgian crown prince had just announced his marriage, and all media attention went to the couple. So only a small part of an article was left for the hacking at the KU Leuven. So even though in 1999 there wasn't much attention given to this problem, there started to raise some questions about how vulnerable the Belgian internet actually was. Some political discussions happened, and even the government started to chip in and said, well, you're actually doing illegal things. All of a sudden, the Belgian internet is something the government had to take on. But also internally, there started to get some discussion. What about rule consistency? Because at the time, there were about 3 or 5 people, and everyone was able to register domains, which meant that there happened some inconsistencies in which domain was allowed and which not. Also, what about personal websites? Well, the internet is growing. People want to get online. And also the question about generic names was still difficult to answer. And maybe the most important reason of discussion is, the growing request and growing markets. In the first year, there were 129 domain registrations. In 1999, there were 23,000. Which, with a small team is very difficult to manage. So the question was asked, yes, how do we solve these problems? It was solved, or an attempt was made in 2000 with a great liberalization. The creation of DNS Belgium was started as a non-profit. And instead of a computer scientist, a CEO now managed the Belgium internet. Also, all rules were thrown out of the window. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, because a lot of research still needs to happen, still with an ever-growing Belgium internet. And it is now the time to interview these people who were the foundations. So I'm going to investigate a little bit more, and I would like to thank you for your attention.